pausing so this can catch up with us. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Ladies Be Architects Platform Developer 1 Certification Study Group. We are currently in week 4 of content for this certification exam, and tonight we have a special guest speaker. So tonight we have one of our very own, Kelsey Shannon, who has volunteered so graciously to present tonight and cover the material that we have that's building upon our week 3. Kelsey is amazing. She's on Twitter, so if you're not following her, I will tell you right now, please go follow her at Kelsey Shannon, Kelsey P. Shannon. She is a development manager and solution architect. She's a 2 times Salesforce certified, and she is also a former SQL developer. I am going to stop here because I learned something new about Kelsey today, actually a few things that are incredibly amazing, and I'm so happy that she's in our study group. It's a true inspiration to hear her background and how she got from point A to B, and she has put together an awesome presentation for us tonight. So I'll open it up to you, Kelsey.
All right, thank you, Blanca. All right, as Blanca said, I am currently a development manager and solution architect, but I actually came into this role with little knowledge of Salesforce and absolutely no knowledge of Apex. I've found that working on getting these certifications in this last year has helped me quickly learn and get up to speed, and preparing for this test in particular has been helpful, very helpful, since I manage a team of Salesforce developers. So thanks to the materials and structure this exam prep this study group has provided, I'm actually now able to read my developer's code and provide recommendations, which is kind of important. I also added a note that I'm a formal SQL developer because I came into that role with no coding experience and a history degree. And if I can do it, anyone can do it, believe me. I feel like I have a unique perspective on this topic since I have transitioned from a non-technical to technical role in the past. And I'm hoping that background will bridge the code speak gap for all the admin developers on the call.
And so we have some comments coming in already. We have Mark asking SQL developer. He's like, you have my sympathies. And then we have history. Brooke says, history? So, I mean, that's awesome. And I really like that you said, you didn't have any code experience and it's helped you better understand how to read the code of the developers. And, it is a journey. And I think that's a fun journey that you've been on.
Definitely. I won't say it hasn't been stressful, but it also has been a lot of fun. All right.
Thank you so much for volunteering tonight.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that all being said, we do have a lot to cover this week, and unfortunately we won't have time for everything. Everything that we won't be covering, I've italicized below, and I encourage everyone to read up on those topics as well. And so at the end of this presentation, I actually have a slide that also has the parts that we will be covering, along with some links and resources to read up on. All right, let's get started. All the topics for logic and process automation revolve around the MVC structure that Salesforce utilizes. This is a software architecture pattern that splits up the development tools depending on whether they affect the data model, the user interface, or business logic. And so the first piece of this model we've actually already covered in prior study groups, although everything we do in Salesforce usually involves the data model in some way. For View, we'll be discussing Visualforce pages, which allow you to customize how data appear inside Salesforce. And then finally, Controller includes business logic such as Apex classes and triggers. I would expect that we'll probably get at least one question on MVC on the test, and it'll probably ask you, is Apex class as model, view, or controller, stuff like that. So it's a good part to know.
Mark says, yes, it will be on the test. And actually, Jennifer brings up a really great point that I forgot to hit on earlier. But folks, if you have a question, if you have a scenario, We have some areas where we'll be doing some live quizzing, so we have some questions for the group tonight. Be ready to unmute, and please don't be bashful. Don't feel like there is a right and wrong answer. I mean, we're learning together, and we just want everyone to be engaged. So be ready to unmute and ask questions and provide some more insight.
All right, I'm actually going to start out with Apex as our first topic while everyone's still wide awake. While you don't actually have to code anything for this exam, it is important you be able to read Apex and understand the elements that make up a class. So I've created this fake class for us to go through on the call that includes all the elements we'll be reviewing. So we're going to keep referring back to this class again and again. This particular class is something I cooked up, womp womp, after my husband decided to try out his new ghost pepper chili flakes this week, and he ruined my meal for the evening. And so I say my meal because he still ate his. The problem this class is trying to solve is that I had planned to use this meal for leftovers during the week, and now I need to go to the grocery store to go pick up some to-go meals. So what it's doing is if the event, the meal is disgusting, so here, see here, if is disgusting, it'll pull the weekdays I was planning on using the meal and add one extra lunch record to my grocery list for every day returned in a query. Okay, I know it's a lot of code up on the screen, but we're going to break it down one by one. And let's go ahead and start at the top. So the first thing you have to do when you start a class is to go ahead and define it. What we're defining here is actually the outer class. So this is the container that holds the code in the body of the class. I always like to think of a class as kind of a box that you hold all the code in, right? Then for every outer class, you must first indicate a required access modifier, and our options are private, public, or global. Private means the code can only be accessed within this class and can't be called by other processes. Private actually can only be used by test classes or init classes, which are those classes that appear within the body of the code. This is because if your class is private and nothing in your outer class, so the outside box is private, and no one else can access it, it's not very useful. So you're really not going to use that much unless if you're creating some sort of test class. So next, public is the modifier you guys are going to see most often in code, and it means that the class is visible within your application. And finally, global means the code can be accessed by all Apex code everywhere. This is most frequently used when you're using the code to call services outside the application. Okay, everyone still with me there?
Mark,
right.
He made a comment that says on the exam you'll get code samples that you have to figure out what a particular result would be or what piece goes into to complete the code.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know.
Yeah,
all right.
there's lots of code samples where they give you a piece of it and you have to kind of figure out what's going on there. And it'll be like, what's the value of this variable, or, what error message would this create, or, what function should go in there, or what kind of modifier should you use, like the sharing mode for code. That's the kind of stuff you see on the exam and the multiple choice questions for code. You're not actually writing any, but you do have to have a good understanding of where things are because they ask you to kind of fill in the blanks.
Definitely. Yeah, and then so I am going to skip over virtual and abstract because they're not really used very often. But I did want to cover this sharing mode, this with sharing and without sharing here. By default, Apex runs in system mode, or so by default it's without sharing, which means that it doesn't check that the user who triggered the code has permissions to be adding to or editing the objects in question. However, if you do want to ensure that your code respects your user permissions, that's when you would add with sharing to your code. Okay. The next piece in the statement, you have to use the actual word class, followed by the class name that you've chosen. And then I'm also going to skip over interfaces and extensions because we have a lot of information to dig into today, and I don't expect you'll get many questions about that on the exam. But if we go back to their example at the beginning, the class we were creating is public, and we named it Husband Ruins Dinner. And you can notice it doesn't have a lot of information here. I don't have a sharing thing in here, so it's defaulting to without sharing. And then I didn't use any of the interfaces or extensions or anything like that. So you can start a class very simply. And then for the next piece of the puzzle, if you aren't going to declare any inner classes, so if you're not going to add any boxes inside your box, then you need to create the method to contain your code. And then that method is the actual thing inside your box you want to use. So big box, things inside it. Whenever you want to pull things out of the box, you actually call it. So you would call these methods. And then every Apex class can have multiple methods inside of it. Okay. So methods also begin with an optional access modifier that defaults to private if you don't declare it. And so what that means is if you set it to private, that means only other pieces of code in this particular class can access it. Or excuse me, only code inside this particular method can access it. That's because protected actually means that code within other methods in this class can access it. Okay, and then we've already talked about public and global. So next, static. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you said that protected means that other methods within the class?
Yeah, so let's go back to the box. I love my boxes. So if you have, so your class is the big box.
Yep.
And your inner classes are the smaller boxes. And each method is the stuff inside that actual box. So if it's private, only the stuff inside the little boxes together can access each other. But if it's protected, the boxes can share as long as they're all inside the bigger box.
Oh, okay. So it still can't be called from another class. So it's kind of like sort of kind of private.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Kelsey, is that related to the flow, when it says public, private? Is that
like as in Cloudflow?
Yeah. Visual.
I'm not sure. Oh, they do have that in Flow, don't they? Public or private?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that. That should be part of our study group, our Cloudflow class mini session.
Guys, I just want to take a quick pause. Kelsey, thanks for that intro. But somebody just logged on, and I want to make a special note because it's actually Hema who just dialed in. And for those of you who were on the call super early, I was talking about Hema because she actually passed the Platform Developer 1 exam, and I received an email from her this morning. And if you're on Twitter, you may have seen that I just shouted her out maybe 20 minutes before our live session started. But Hema, great congratulations to you. We are so very proud of you, and it really is even an honor that you're on the call with us tonight.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thank you so much for the resources and all the support you have given to me and made me part of this group. So it really helped me. If you don't mind, I just want to share some insights, how I prepared everything. Is this the best time or you want me to wait for some time?
I know that you passed the exam, and I'd hate to keep you the whole time if you weren't going to be on. But folks, and actually, Kelsey, will you be okay if we let her provide some insight?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Or else I can just add some strategies or anything that I remember. Depending on the topics, I can add those in our list.
Yeah, well, feel free to, spend, a few minutes giving just whatever you want. And then if you stay on the call, you're more than welcome to help us out and chip in and weigh in.
Yeah, surely. It's been a very honor to me to be part of this group. It really helped me to enhance my skills. Like I was working on this certification since 1 month, and I was following Brad Woman Code materials where I did my initial training there, like coaching. I got coaching from that group, and then it inspired me. And afterwards, I followed the some plural sites, Apex Academy sessions from the videos which you have given to me, and also it really helped me. Those video sessions gave me really insight, depth of understanding how the code works and everything. And then your material gave me more overall enhancement. Like I was going like which way I'm going. I was thinking like I was stranded in different places, but this material helped me to just brush up my things and get ready for the exam.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and that's what it's all about. We all can bring what information we know and we've learned and we've experienced and just help one another. And if you haven't already seen the chat box, Hima, you really should go take a look because everyone is sending you so many messages in there.
Great. Thank you so much for all of your support and everyone. I really appreciate this group. And always feel free to reach out to me if you want any thoughts or any insight, like how this exams goes. But I really say that if you are fundamentally stand on, like if you are, I don't know how to put this in words, but if you are confident in the content of these materials, then you should go for the exam. All the best to you all.
Yes, and that's what we're here for, to learn more and build confidence. And thank you for sharing that journey. And you are more than welcome to join us for as long as you want.
Sure. I would love to. It's like, again, we learn many things from different people. Like it's not one step and then we are finished. It's an ongoing process, like learning everything, whatever we can.
Yeah, well, thank you. And again, congratulations. That
Thank
is
you so
a
much.
job extremely well done. And we are just so very happy for you.
And the resources through the links also really helped me. The trailhead, everything, and things which you have provided in the slides and the video sessions, they really helped me to gain confidence and go for the exam.
Well, everyone, if you are on mute, that's great. But let's just all give a quick clap to Hima.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I love this. Okay, mission getting certified, everybody. Here we come.
One down, all of us to go.
All right, so speaking of all of us to go, I don't want to cut you off, Hima, but we do have a lot of content. I will tell you all, we have quite a few people who have joined us. Please, grab yourself a cup of water or ice or something that make sure you're awake. This is a lot of content, but Kelsey has taken a lot of time to pace it out for us so that it makes sense. And remember, if you have a question, type it in the chat box, unmute your lines and ask the question. If you have real life experience, feel free to weigh in because that's how we learn. So thank you, and I'll hand it back over to you, Kelsey.
All right, awesome. All right, so we already went through the access modifiers. Another type of access modifier is the static option right there. That's a modifier that means the method doesn't need an instance of a class to run. And I know that's a bit confusing, but when you do the Apex modules in Trailhead, you'll notice the static declaration allows for less code in order to run the class. Basically, you can call the class without a line declaring or instantiating it first. So I really encourage you guys to go through, I think it's one of the first Apex modules where they actually have you add static and then change how you write the code. Okay. So the next field required is data type returned by the method. So you could return a string or integer. However, if the method doesn't return anything, meaning it doesn't spit any data out afterwards, you can actually list void as your data type. Next, your method name, and then optionally you can put some input parameters that are required in the code. So coming back to our code example, we have the big box class of the husband ruins dinner, and the method is inside that box, and that method is public, meaning other classes in the system can call it. It's static, meaning we don't have to instantiate it. We can just call it straight out. Void means it doesn't actually return anything. Overseas and nil is my name of it, and then I'm actually returning I have three input parameters. A Boolean, like a true or false, is it disgusting? A string for what was my planned meal, and a date for what week are we in. Everybody with me?
Can I just ask, because I know that we have thrown out this term, or Kelsey has tonight, instantiate, and I know that on our last session, Kelly also introduced it. Does anyone on the call remember what instantiate means? Don't be bashful.
No, I'm not even sure how to spell it.
Okay. Kelsey, can you just review that?
Yeah, so instantiating basically means you're calling it into existence.
I think
of an easier way to say that.
I think of the word instance as kind of the root word in there, and so if you have an instance of something, then you have an occurrence, or it exists. So you're making an instance is what I think of.
And yes, Melissa has the spelling correct in the chat box. I just saw that pop up.
So
Yeah, that's a tough one.
You're basically creating it and storing it in the memory, but you may not actually be creating a thing. Is that kind of what it means? It's like
yes, I like that.
Really creating it.
Much better. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thanks for reviewing that for us.
All right, so the next section are collections. So collections are complex data types used to hold multiple values in the memory, like we said, so you can use them in your code. And the three most commonly used ones are list, set, and match. The main difference between lists and sets is that a list is ordered and a set is unordered. You would use a list when you need values in a particular order, and a set when the order doesn't matter, but you do need to exclude duplicates. Finally, a map is used for key value pairs, where you need to have multiple fields grouped together and it matters. So like unique IDs and their names, those always need to be together. And in our example class, I actually have two lists. The first one is the leftovers, and the second one is the actual grocery list. And then before we leave the slide, I'd also like to call attention to the syntax of these different parts of the code. In the exam, you'll most likely be asked to choose the right syntax between a list of options. And honestly, the easiest way to remember the right structure is to practice writing it yourself. It's kind of hard to stare at these code snippets and then remember later on the test where that parentheses or where that bracket is supposed to go. So that's where Trailhead is really the place to be for these items. Next, we're going to talk about control structure. So AWS code also provides multiple ways to control the flow of code. This means instead of reading the code top to bottom, these control statements allow you to either use or skip sections based on certain criteria or loop back to prior sections. This is all done in the name of code efficiency and not writing the same thing multiple times. So we'll be covering if-else statements and loops today, as switch statements are more rarely used in my experience. So digging into the if-else statements. All right, so there's actually three ways to utilize these statements, and I promise it's not as confusing as it looks. Okay, so starting off with if, an if by itself runs whenever a Boolean statement inside of it evaluates to true. One way to think about this is that it works the same way as validation rules. If it's true, it executes, otherwise it doesn't run. You can have multiple validation rules, and they will all fire if they're true. Same thing if. You can have multiple if statements. If they're all true, they all fire. The if-else statement is a little different in that it allows for multiple conditions, and the else only executes if the closest if statement is false. So if this is false, it moves on to the else. And then finally, we have an else-if statement. Also allows for multiple if scenarios, but it exits once the statement evaluates to true. So if you have a whole bunch of else-ifs, it exits right whenever it hits a true statement. And so I really like this image because it shows how you can use all three in the same code if you really want to. And hopefully to lock that in, I have a little quiz for you guys. Let me get y'all involved. So the question is, if a cat weighs 15 pounds, how much food will they get based on the logic below? Anybody?
3.5.
Okay, anybody else?
15 pounds. So that way 15, right?
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing whoever that is.
There was a little bit of an echo when you were speaking. Do you want to maybe try to type it in the chat box? Susie says, heaps, 3.5 plus 3 plus 2.58. Melissa says, 15 pounds, is that what the cat weighs?
Yes.
Susie says 2.5.
All right, so Susie's our winner.
Oh, Sophie, I'm so sorry.
Oh,
I'm
Sophie.
so sorry, Sophie. I
All
didn't
right,
have only one cup of coffee today, so I'm a little tired. Sorry about that, Sophie.
Yeah. So this is actually a trick question. So since these are all if statements, they keep evaluating. So it's going to go through the bottom three statements and keep evaluating every one that's true. So at first it's going to set it to 3.5, but whenever it goes to the second one, it's actually going to override it and put it to 3 and then 2.5. So if we had used else statements, once line 2 became true, everything else would exit. Does that make sense? Okay, and I also like to say if you write your code this way, you're going to have a very unhappy cat.
Oh, look at that unhappy cat. Melissa is asking a question and it starts evaluating at the bottom.
So what it's going to do, it's going to evaluate every condition because these are all if. So it's going to say, is cat greater than or equal to 16? No, it's going to move on. Then it's going to evaluate this one, and because it is greater than 14, it'll make meal, this variable meal, equal 3.5. So when it moves on to the next one, this one's also true. And since we used if instead of an else statement, it's going to overwrite 3 ounces and then 2.5 ounces.
And Sophie did include in the chat box, if you want it to be exclusive, not cumulative, it needs to be if else.
Mm-hmm. Is it if else or else if? I was confused by those.
Else if, Mark says.
All right, moving on to some more control structure. We're going to talk about loops now. Loops allow you to continue to reiterate the same piece of code, so like a section of code, until a condition evaluates to true. And so to provide more flexibility with this loop structure, we actually have 3 different options: a for loop, a do while, and a while. We're going to start with for loops. These are the ones that I see used most often, and then we have a further 3 different types of for loops that you might see on the exam. The traditional for loop is the one that you see in the Apex trailhead on this. This allows you to increment through until the exit condition evaluates to true. And we're going to break this one down even further in a later slide, so don't worry about it. The list or set iteration allows you to evaluate all records you place into a collection. And when they have all been touched, the loop exits. So what it's going to do is every time it runs through the loop or this code block, it's going to check to see if it has all the records listed in this list or set. And when it gets to the end, it'll exit out. Okay, and then finally, you can also loop through a SOQL query, and that's what I actually did in our leftovers example. I used this last option. You can see the SOQL query where I used the input parameters for the method and returned weekday values. So a quick question for you guys. If there's 3 weekdays returned for this in this query right here, I'm going to stop putting my mouse over it.
Yeah, then the little pop-up comes up. There it goes. Now we can see it.
All right. If there's 3 weekdays, how many times will this loop run? So this query at the bottom, if it returns 3 records for 3 weekdays, how many times does the loop beneath it run?
I don't see anything. Is it just me?
Can you see the bottom one right here?
It's the one line in the one.
Oh, it's okay. It's blocked by
covering
my
up.
little thing. Okay.
I know. I gotta stop putting my mouse up there. And I promise this one's not a trick. You might have lost trust.
Every time I unmute, it covers it up again. What was the question?
So in this loop, we're using a SOQL query to query how many weekdays are in this leftover planning object. And we'll get into SOQL queries later. But if this query returns 3 records, how many times is this loop going to run?
So Jennifer Weaver said 3. Jennifer Bowen said 3 questioning. And Sophie said 1 time per return result for the SOQL query equals 3.
Okay. Yeah, I promise this one wasn't a trick. All right, and then so the next 2 kinds of loops we have a do while and a while. Sounds like a rap song.
It does.
The do while is unique in that the first statement will always execute before the condition is evaluated. What that means is it will always run at least once, even if the Boolean is false. So that we'll definitely see that on the exam.
Yes.
And it is. And it's also possible for the while loop to never run at all. So I'd say the while loop is kind of like an if statement in reverse, because it only runs if the statement is false.
So this was something that when we did the RAD cohort, I know there was a few of us that were stuck on this, and some of the notes that I had to add is when you think of the while, remember that it's checking the condition before. And then the do while is checking the condition afterwards. And as Kelsey stated, it always runs at least once. And everyone's digging this rap song thing.
All right, so back to the for loop, because this one's a little bit trickier because it doesn't exactly run in the order you'd expect. So what happens is first the initiation statement and exit conditions are run. But then it skips over the increment statement and executes the code block. And it goes back to step 2. So what it does is to go initiation statement, exit condition, code block, increment. And then it just loops through exit, code block, increment, exit, code block, increment. I don't know, okay, right. So this is one you guys just might want to memorize. Is the order for this. But to make sure you remember it, we have a fun quiz. All right, so you were just staring at it. What is the correct sentence to write a for loop? Correct syntax to write a for loop, pardon me. Choose 2 answers.
Not one. It
Two.
says choose 2 answers. She's really quizzing us on real life Salesforce certification exam question structures. Olivia says A and D. Mark says, oh, hide and seek champions in this question. And Sophie says B and C.
All right, so the answer actually is B and C. So the reason why A is wrong, because I'm kind of mean here, actually switched around the exit condition and the increment statement. So they're backwards.
Wait a minute. You deliberately tried to trick us here?
I know. I'm rethinking all my questions now. And then D is incorrect because the increment statement is after the code block, though I would argue this is where it belongs because that's the actual order it goes in. That's confusing. So I'll go back to, so these 2, this is the SOQL query loop, and this is the list loop. And make sure you have the right one in your head. This is the actual correct structure.
And we already have comments coming in. And look out for missing semicolons. And also look out for mixed semicolon and commas.
That's really tricky one.
And Mark says
what did I use?
Ultimate hide and seek champion is the semicolon. What does the punctuation indicate? Is the question Melissa asked. And what does
the punctuation just provides like system, it's telling the system that this particular statement is stopped and moving on to another one. It's kind of like when you use Excel and you're building a formula, you put a comma in there to indicate the system that you're putting in your next condition. Does that make sense? And I will say,
Melissa's also asking, how do we know it should be a colon or a semicolon or a period?
Sometimes you just got to memorize it. I will say, in most cases, you're going to look for the semicolons at the end of statements. Periods you'll only use in dot notation. So whenever you're trying to link together an object and a field name. I wrote this out, and obviously, luckily, I put this as one of the wrong ones. I missed that the first one's a semicolon, this one's a comma. So this is a bit tricky. I hope at least Salesforce wouldn't be that mean on the test. But now I'm really going to remember. Now I'm going to really remember that these are semicolons, though.
And Mark added a semicolon is usually a single item, where a colon is usually when it's a complex data type. Where a colon is usually used when it's a complex data type.
That's a good one. I like that.
And he provides in the chat an example.
Yeah. And I will say, whenever I used to do SQL development, those semicolons were my worst nightmare because your entire code could fail and you just miss one semicolon, but there's nothing that the code build will tell you because the semicolon just tells the code to stop, so there's nothing else to like, hey, dummy, you forgot semicolon. So it's just like hide and seek, like Mark said. All right. I have another fun one for you guys. What will be the final value of X when this loop finishes?
Anyone?
Bueller?
What is the final value of X when the loop finishes?
Seven? I'm starting to feel
Sophie got it again.
I'm getting all these wrong. I'm starting to feel like a dummy.
All right, so the answer is 7. Or sorry, yeah, the answer is 7. Excuse myself. Because what's happening is, so x plus 1, so the first time it runs, and remember with the do while loop, do always runs at least once. So it'll be 2, continue over 3, 4, 5, 6. And when it hits 6, it's still less than or equal to 6, so it's going to run one more time. And that'll be 7. And since 7 is greater than 6, then it'll exit the loop. Yeah, I'm feeling mean with these questions.
No, I mean, this is good because, one, it keeps us on our toes tonight because it is a lot of content, right? But we really do need to understand how to read code and how to take a step back and think, okay, let me look at what I have here and try to interpret what it's doing and how it's doing it. So these are great quiz questions.
Yeah, and the best thing to do is just really try to not panic when you get these code snapshots. A lot of times it makes more sense than you think if you just read through it slowly.
And so, Kelsey, if it were just a while statement instead of a do while statement,
What would the answer be?
right?
I think it'd still be 7, wouldn't it?
Because doesn't while only run if it's false?
Yeah. So if you put this while at the top and it's the x plus x equals x plus 1 in the middle, I think the answer would still be 7. Unless I'm thinking about it wrong.
6, Mark says.
No, I believe Mark more than me.
I mean, and I have no idea. Because I'm trying.
Yeah, I have to see it.
Brain.
So these are really common kind of error, and they're known as an off by 1 error. And you see these a lot in different for loops. And I have a document I'm going to share in our Slack channel. There's a site that talks about tracking down off by 1 errors.
Ah.
Awesome.
Please share it in our resources link in the Google Docs.
We'll make sure it gets in both.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
Okay, moving on from control structure into my favorite part, which is queries. And honestly, it's my favorite part because it's what I'm most familiar with. Although I will say SOQL is just fairly different enough from SQL to confuse me a lot of times. So I'm also not going to go too deep into this topic because I really believe it's something that you'll learn best by practicing and running through Trailhead modules. Another great way to practice these queries is just jump into the developer console and try and query different parts of your home organization. See if you can figure out how many contacts in your system have the last name Smith. Or see how many, accounts in your system are in the US. Just keep querying, thinking up questions, and you'll get the hang of this pretty quickly. The key for you to remember, go ahead.
I'll just add that as you're taking a dive and you're just testing this out in your developer console, it's trial and error. Like you'll try it one way and then you'll be like, no, that's not what I was looking for. I was really expecting for this to be returned. And that's the way that you learn, because then you realize, okay, I should have made the query this way, or maybe you were just a little bit backwards or off by just a little bit. But really that is the one way, like know your data that you're querying. And then that way you can kind of check yourself to make sure that you're returning what it is that you expected. And it takes practice. So if you go in there and you have some syntax errors, I mean, that's not the end of the world. We all experience that. Every single one of us. I mean, every developer, has to look at missing semicolons and dots here and there and everywhere. So, be patient with yourself and just keep trying, because that's the best way to learn is hands-on.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say queries are one of the easier ones to play around with, because just one line of code can return, results for you. You don't have to set up the whole structure and get the whole structure in place for it to work. Just one line can give you a whole list of stuff. So it's definitely an easier one to play around with. And so the key thing for you guys to remember on the exam is that there's two different ways for developers to pull information into the system. So the first is the SOQL, I'm talking about above, and that's best used for returning specific details from one or more objects. I will say I've never seen SOSL in particular used in any code in my system in my particular environment, but it's really good for doing broader searches, especially if you want to look at multiple objects at the same time and return a text string. You can search everything just based on a text string. And so the key for the exam is to be still familiar with how the syntax will be constructed and be able to pick the right syntax out of the lineup. And so back to our original example again, we still have this SOQL query where I'm querying how many weekdays from the leftover plane object where the planned meal this week got ruined.
And if you all have your chat and people little dashboard area open, when Kelsey's going over these bottom snippets of code, minimize it, because I know I had to minimize mine so I could see the full line. And the slides will be available afterwards in our Google Drive as always, so you can always review it again later. But during the live session, just feel free to minimize your chat box to see all the way to the end of the screen, and then you can maximize it later.
Yeah, and then after this session, I'll also go in and add all the answers to the quizzes.
Kelsey, where in the query do you say that it's ruined?
So this is actually, I don't say it anywhere here.
Okay.
What I'm actually doing is pulling in the variables. So where you see this colon right here, this is actually referring back to where I was pulling variables into my code.
Okay.
And so the code actually runs only if the meal was disgusting. I think we just have a couple more slides, and I'm gonna pull up the code piece again and walk through the whole thing all over again. All right, and because I love quizzes, let's try another one. So if a developer needs to query all dogs at the shelter who are less than 5 years old and haven't been adopted yet, which statement below holds the correct syntax? I'll give you guys a minute to read. All right, has anyone figured it out yet?
Sophie says C. Brooke says A.
Brooke is our winner.
We got 2 A's too. We had Kelsey said A too. And then Sophie said, nope, sorry, A.
All right, so the answer is A. So B and C are both trying to mess you up a little bit. So on B, the Boolean statement, this is adopted, actually has quotations are false, and that's actually not required on Boolean statements. And you can actually, this isn't case sensitive or anything, you could have lowercase true, uppercase true. I think you could even do 0 or 1. It's just not required on this. Okay, and then species as well. This is another tricky one. It has double quotes. When it comes to SOQL, everything's in single quotes. Okay. And then finally, C is a little more obvious because whenever you're using custom objects, so basically anything that's on opportunities, accounts, contacts, the ones you're really familiar with, you have to have this __ C after the word. So that's just for custom. And so I don't have that _ C under age, species, or pet. Oh, and also I don't have it under name because name is a standard field whenever you create any object.
And Jennifer saying tricky, tricky. And Mark added, if you put quotations on there, you actually are feeding a string, which isn't stored in a Boolean variable. And Melissa says she understands much better. Yeah, it is confusing, and they're just like these little things. It's kind of, I think it's Don Robbins says, you know, we want to tell you what it is that you don't know that you should know. And these are really great examples, Kelsey.
All right, so our final piece of the Apex puzzle is the data manipulation language. So once you've brought records into your Apex class and you've altered them in the memory, you then need a way to get the information back into the database, which is where the DML comes in. The valid operations for DML include insert, update, merge, delete, and undelete. Excuse me. And I guess that the upsert and merge are probably the less obvious ones for you. So upsert actually checks whether the record already exists, and if it does exist, it will update it, and if it doesn't exist, it'll insert into the database. So it's kind of like a quality check. And usually you have to use a field count like email or maybe the external ID or something like that to do that check. Then merge
Melissa
actually
says upsert is her favorite.
yeah, it is a weird word. And then merge allows you to merge up to 3 different records into the same object type. So let's say if you have some duplicates going on. And so there's actually 2 different ways for you to add these records to Salesforce. So the first one is the DML statement. This one's more basic. You'll see it's just insert grocery list. If the operation fails, however, an exception is thrown, which means an error pops up. That's what they mean when they say exception is thrown, and then all your changes are rolled back. So if you want a partial success, you're actually going to have to use a database class method, which requires a little bit more code. And so it allows you to do partial inserts. So if you have 5 records and 3 of them fail, you'll still get 2 records added to the database. All right, so let's go ahead and put it all back together, all the little pieces that we were talking about. So who can tell me what this top level is? What is this called?
Brooke says the name of the class.
Yes, this is the
Sophie
class.
says class signature. Melissa says class name. And
All
then
those are correct.
Mark is saying database.insert is an example of a static method. You don't have to create a database instance in order to use it. So he's adding another what we should know. Jennifer says declaring a class. Melissa says instantiate. I say don't let the husband cook dinner.
I know. I will say my husband cooks all of our dinners, so I probably should be more grateful.
And Mark adds, no, we're not instantiating. He must write class declaration.
All right, so what's this next piece called?
Declaring a method.
Yes,
Jennifer.
exactly. All right, moving on. What are these?
HEMA says method declaration with not return type. Oh, so we rewind a little bit. I think she brings up a good point here because she's talking about the void. If we back up, if we rewind just a little bit, if you can just walk us through that, because I think that is a good thing for us to remember moving forward.
Yeah, so the void means it doesn't return any information that's going to be used in another class. Right? So we are inserting information to the database, but we're not actually returning any information that's going to be used. So if we were returning information, so let's say we were going to output a 3, and then that 3 is then going to trigger another class further down here. Maybe, remind me to, I don't know, remind me to actually cook the to-go meals or something like that. then instead of void, we put integer. And we were planning to return an integer. Does that make sense?
Do you have to declare the void? What if you just don't put any?
Yep, that's required.
So if you don't put it in there, then it assumes that the program assumes that you're going to use that variable somewhere else, and it's going to ask you for some sort of variable type.
Here, let me just skip back. Okay, so everything I have bolded here is required. You have to have that in your stuff. So if we have an access modifier, if we don't put anything, so it's not required. If we don't put anything, it will default to private for methods. The data type is required. So if you don't have a data type, you put void. Otherwise, you put an integer. Okay, method name is required. That's just what you call it. And then I have all the input parameters here. And I think I actually cheated a little bit in the class, you'll see, and I put the parameters in a different location. Oh, and I just gave the answer. These are parameters. You also see them called variables. They're also primitive data types, all that kind of stuff. All right, a couple more questions. All right, what is this called? Yes, DPEC, that's a collection.
Sorry, guys. Baby Blazer is up.
That's no problem.
What's missing in action for a few minutes, but I'm back.
Yeah, we're just rolling along. All right, so this is a collection, and this collection type is a list. Next part we have here, we've already talked about, this is the SOQL query inside the for loop with the DML statement at the bottom. So let's go all the way back again and talk through it. And I saw some comments. I apologize for my method issues.
Isn't it bad to have a SOQL query inside a for loop? Aren't you? Isn't that bulkifying the?
So technically, this isn't inside the for loop. It has to be in this code block to be inside the for loop. And I actually have a slide. Yeah, so I have a slide later where I've actually called that out so you can see the difference between the two.
Okay.
Yeah, because it is a little confusing.
And that is a great question. Because I know that our coach, and I see Kelly joined us, Leslie, she actually said if she could, she wants to make a shirt that says on the front, we do SOQL queries outside the for loop.
Yeah, because whenever you put it in this section, you're actually still outside the for loop at this time. You're just declaring what you're going to iterate over. So if you have it inside this code block inside the bracket, then every time the loop runs, the query runs. And that's what you don't want to do. Okay, so let's talk it through one more time to make sure it's clear. So at first, we're declaring this public class, husband brings dinner, and then declaring the method inside this class, overseas and meal, which if some people point out there needs to be a little bracket here, since I did put the variables in there. Okay, then I have three variables. Boolean is discussion, so true or false. A string, so I will hold my planned meal, and a date of this week. And so whenever I call this class, I'm actually going to have to input these three methods to make sure it works. And then I have two other variables, complex data types, two lists, one leftover planning list and one grocery list. Then it hits the loop statement. So, but the loop will only run if it's discussing is true. If it's discussing is false, it'll actually skip down to here, to the grocery list, check if the grocery list has anything in it. It doesn't. So this exits 2, and then we're out of the code. So let's say is discussing does evaluate to true. So for this list, so we're pulling in this list here, the leftover planning list, and we're putting into it this SOQL query, which is pulling every weekday where the meal I've inserted here, the planned meal, and for this week returns. And so it'll add a new line item to the grocery list for every one of those. So 3 weekdays, 3 grocery lists. Next, we'll drop down to this, and we'll say, and also notice this is a DML statement, which also needs to be outside the loop. So the bracket starts here and ends here. So we put this DML statement outside the loop. And if it's greater than 0, we'll go ahead and insert the grocery list all at one time. Everybody got it?
I think Mark added the SOQL query there is basically like a complex data type. As it's returning a list, you just don't have to assign that list to a variable.
Gotcha. All right, next topic. We got through the first one. All right, so triggers. The triggers allow you to perform custom actions on Salesforce records when certain criteria are triggered. So this is kind of similar to how a workflow rule or process builder are triggered in Salesforce. You have to meet certain conditions for it to happen. Only we use a trigger when the logic is too complex to be done with those declarative tools. So triggers can be written entirely in one piece of code, but it's actually best practice for them to instead reference standalone Apex classes, which that's a lot of words, but we'll come back to that in this couple of slides. So there are 2 types of triggers, and they both use the same event scenarios. Insert, update, delete, merge, our favorite upsert, and undelete. A situation where you'd use it before a trigger, this is where you need to modify records before they're ever saved to the database. However, records that, sorry, back up a little bit, after triggers are used to access systems, set values like maybe an ID or last modified date. However, records that fire after triggers are read-only, so you can't touch them. But a scenario of, and by touch them I mean you can't edit them. They're already in the system. They're instantiated, but not saved to the database yet. There's that for you. And so an example of a scenario where you would use an after trigger would be, let's say we want to automatically create some contacts once an account is created. You need the account ID to create those contacts, so you need to perform this action in an after statement. So the syntax to declare a trigger is as follows. So the word trigger, followed by the name of your trigger, the word on, the object you want to use to kick off the trigger, and then the event. So before insert, before update, before merge, after upsert, anything you can think of. So in this example here, you can see we have the trigger name, the word trigger, the trigger name, which I just noticed is update proposal amount. That's from my environment. Awesome. On our custom object opportunity proposal, and it only fires after a record is inserted or updated, which means we can't actually touch any of the records within opportunity proposal, but we can do things to other objects using that ID. Which makes sense, because if you read what this trigger name is doing, it's actually updating an amount on the opportunity once this proposal is inserted or updated. Okay, and then once you have declared your trigger, then you put your code in the bracketed block right here. So yours goes here. Triggers also allow you to use context variables to access the information in the system at runtime, such as previous and current values of fields being changed. You also use these to check the conditions that kicked off the trigger. So for example, by checking whether the triggering event was an insertion or update, you can actually have your code perform different actions for different scenarios. And it is best practice to only have one trigger per object, and to perform this efficiently, you need what's called a handler class. So this is one trigger that contains all the events, like before update, before insert, after update, after insert. So it has all of those in the events. And then it uses these context variables, like is insert and is update, to call the appropriate classes for the action that triggered the code. And here's what I'm talking about with this trigger handler. So this one fires both on after insert and after update, as you can see. But it provides a different set of variables for the class to handle after insert. If you see, this is using the same. So opportunity trigger handler is the name of the class, and handle after insert is the name of the method. And so it's the same method being used in two different ways. So if it's a is insert method, they only want to pull in the new fields that are coming in, because there are no old fields, it's new. And if it's an after insert, you want to pull in both the new and the old values. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions?
I just want to say that with the triggers, this is also something that you may need to spend some more time on. And I know that we've shared this resource probably on every session, but I just want to reiterate that if you go to the Women Code Heroes website that we've referenced in many of our slide decks and in our study tool resources spreadsheet in the Google Drive, there's an excellent blog post by Karen Jameson, founder of Rad Women Code, on Apex triggers. And I would say that if anyone is feeling a little bit overwhelmed at this point, that's normal. And just hang in there. For me, when I had to go through and learn this, it took me some time, reviewing the materials that I read on the blog, listening to the recordings from our sessions, and reading stuff on Trailhead and in other areas. So, feel free to ask questions as you're going along today, and even after our live session, to ask in the Slack or Twitter area, and look for that resource, that blog, Women Code Heroes. And Mark had actually entered in something. He said, on the exam, there's quite a few questions about the context you should choose for a trigger to run. So thanks, Kelsey, for covering that. And then he also includes test taking tips. One thing to really think about is whether an action should happen before or after there's a record ID. There's no record ID with before triggers. So if you see something that relies on ID, like populating a related list or a child record creation, it has to be an after. And those are excellent tips. And Sumath, thanks for dropping that link in there. That's exactly the one that I'm talking about. I'm looking at my hard copy. I actually print out everything, so I have notes with that. But great resource, guys. Check it out. And again, watch this video again and reach out online and ask questions, and use the time that we have now as well to ask questions.
Yeah, and I'm also always available if anyone needs some one-on-one time. I'm more than happy. I learn more the more I teach. All right, because I'm mean, let's do another quiz. All right, a developer is required to create a trigger that prevents users from adding a duplicate product onto an opportunity. What trigger event should they use? Is it before merge, after insert, after update, or before insert?
Melissa says before insert. Jane, before insert. Jennifer, Sumath say D, which is before insert. We have all before inserts.
Everybody gets it. Awesome. All right, and then one more question. This is a little bit trickier. Will the code below succeed or throw an error? And so this is just getting you guys used to reading code a little bit more, but what's happening is we have this trigger, husband ruins dinner on meal planning, after insert. I have my 2 grocery lists. And then if it's disgusting, so we have the new right here. That's the new field on insert. Can't use old because there is no old field, it's a new one. And then if it's disgusting, then we go through this loop, which is the trigger new. So every new record is going to run through it and add it to the system. And the reason why we're having to use the after insert is because we're pulling from the leftover playing list and inserting into the grocery list. So, will this code succeed?
We have some folks saying before, oh, I think these are from the previous question. Looks like yes, but I may be wrong.
All right, so I'll be nice and let you guys know the answer. So this is actually going to fail, because what's going to happen is that once we insert it into this grocery list, it's actually going to trigger the trigger to run again. And so what that's going to do is cause it to be in an infinite loop. And the reason why infinite loops are bad is because you start hitting governor limits, which brings me to governor limits. So these are limits monitored by the Salesforce system that causes your code to fail. And this is necessary because of Salesforce's multi-tenant architecture. We don't want one piece of poorly written code to lock down the entire system because it starts looping forever. So here are a few examples of the ones I see get hit most in my org, especially 100 SOQL queries or 150 DML statements, so there are quite a few more in place. That being said, there is absolutely nothing in Apex to prevent you from writing and pushing a piece of code to production that will hit your governor limits. That's why it's so important to test your code in book scenarios and follow the design standards. One important one that I see a lot in my environment, we've hinted at this before, is SOQL queries placed in for loops. So by inside the for loop, I mean within these brackets right here. And so you see the query right here. It's outside, this one's actually outside the bracket, so it's outside the for loop. So writing code like that in the left could work if you're only updating one account at a time in the front of the application, but the minute you do a bulk load, such as updating records through data loader, or if you have some sort of integration going on, you're going to hit the 100 SOQL query limit pretty fast. So the best practice is always to query once and then iterate it, kind of like what we do on the result on the right. You should also place your DML statements outside of loops. There's a limit of 150 transactions on those. And rather than inserting or updating records one at a time, you should compile all your changes in the memory and insert them all at one time at the end of the class. Next piece of the rule we love to break at my company, which is one trigger per object. This is where the handler class comes into play because it allows you to control the order in which your triggers fire. It's also much more efficient for figuring out what your triggers actually do down the line. I don't know if I should say this, but we have about 20 triggers on our opportunity object right now. Because at the time it was easy for the developers to create a new trigger and try and integrate it into that handler class. So right now we're spending a lot of time pulling out those triggers and trying to get them all in the handler class. So it's easy to do it the first time. You should also watch out for code that triggers other processes. For example, we recently came across an area in my org where we built a new process loader flow, and the second we turned it on, we started hitting that max CPU time limit. We could not figure out what was wrong with the flow, so we contacted support to find out what was wrong. And we found that we actually had an old recursive trigger already in our production, and something about that process loader made us start hitting that max CPU time. So we actually had to refactor that trigger. We'd have to change anything in the process loader, and suddenly everything's working again. And then finally, to state again, this last line, make sure your code can handle more than one record insert or update at a time. And I actually linked a good article in the bottom here, the 15 Apex commandments. It's a pretty nice, succinct overview as a
That one
15.
is really good, and
Yeah.
everybody who talks about anything code base for Salesforce will point you in that direction. I've come across it on different blogs that I've been reading and during the Red Women class, and it's referenced a lot. So if you have not seen that yet, do click on that link when you get the slides and download that.
And then also every commandment starts with thy shall, which I find pretty entertaining. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to Visualforce.
Actually, can I just pause 1 second here? It
Yeah,
looks like
absolutely.
Mark chimed in. Salesforce also does one magical thing on triggers. It only sends in batches of 200 to a trigger, no matter how many records are actually sent. They're broken into batches of 200.
Yeah, but I'll also say that 200 is too many. So your SOQL query limit is 100 and your DML statement is 150. So even though it's in 200, it's going to be too much if you haven't written your code properly. All right, now for Visualforce. So Visualforce is a coding language used to alter the user interface with Salesforce. So that's the view portion of our MVC model that we talked about in the beginning. Example code for this section is the page to display that grocery list we populated in our Apex class example. So we'll have a title grocery list at the top and a table right here that contains all the grocery list items in 2 columns, aisle and ingredient. Now this doesn't seem like a lot of code to display a customized interface, and that's all thanks to the top, which is the standard controller. So what's a controller? So control is a set of instructions on what happens when a user interacts with a page, and we have lots of different types. The standard control is what's used most often. That's what was in the example before. This allows you to provide all the same functionality and logic as a standard Salesforce page just by declaring it in the beginning of the page, which is awesome. The standard list controller, which we also use in the previous example, allows you to display a set of records, not just individual records, such as multiple grocery line items. However, if the standard controller doesn't provide enough functionality, you can actually create your own custom controller using the Apex class. The tricky part, however, with custom controllers is that by using one, you have to re-implement all the functionality of the standard Salesforce page, and nothing comes by default. And then finally, a controller extension is also an Apex class. You can create and extend functionality for standard or custom controllers. When should you use one or the other? Usually, a lot of times it has to do with permissions. So standard controllers always execute in user mode. So that means if a user can't see a record or a field in Salesforce normally, they can't see it on the Visualforce page. So a lot of times you'd use a custom controller because you want to override that, because by default, custom controllers execute in system mode, which means the user has full access to see everything you place on that page. However, it is possible to restrict permissions in your custom controllers if you need to use one for other reasons. Okay, and then I'm always harping on the syntaxes in Visualforce that you need to get familiar with it for the exam. You always start with Apex page at the top of every page, followed by the word standard controller or controller. Controller is what you use for custom. So if you use a standard controller, you declare the object you are primarily displaying. So this could be this could be account or opportunity. However, if you use a custom controller, you actually call the Apex class and makes that your controller. So right here. I'm reading comments real quick.
Oh, I didn't even notice.
So Mark, you said there's questions about VF syntax?
Yes, on the exam there are questions about Visualforce syntax, and
I thought you were telling me the questions. Okay.
No. In the exam,
What
there
is
are
it?
definitely questions about the declaring a controller, declaring a custom controller and controller extension, and you have questions that are like, here's this, and what are, like, you're given this list of 5 things and go pick 2 that are accurate ways to declare a controller for a Visualforce. And they're a mixture of the different, like, custom controller and controller extensions and list controllers. So that is stuff that you do need to know quite well.
Yeah, and HEMA reiterates what Mark said. Custom controller and extension controller will be on the exam for sure.
Awesome.
Can I just, if folks are familiar with Visualforce and this is not new, can you just type in like VF in the chat box so we can kind of gauge how many of us are familiar with this and how many of us this is a little bit more foreign? There's no right and wrong. So, okay, we got one person that's familiar. We got a few. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm glad I asked. And folks, I want to add that as we go through content, if there are areas that you need a little bit more support in, feel free to voice that. That is not anything negative. If anything, it's great that you acknowledge that it's an area of weakness and that you need a little bit more support. So I know for me, for sure, this is kind of a foreign area, and I spent some time on and off during lunchtime breaks and on the weekends. On Pluralsight, Matt Lacey, I think is his name, has an intro to Visualforce. Take a peek at it if you got that free 30-day pass. If you don't have access to that paid subscription platform called Pluralsight, email me and I will send you a code so you can get a 30-day free pass. And then make sure to ask questions as we go along tonight and throughout the weeks. It doesn't have to like be dead after tonight's session. We never talk about it again, okay? Just make sure to like let us know. And if I see any other areas outside of what we already have for trailheads and reading assignments, then I will make sure to share resources that I find as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Blanca. All right. Visualforce methods. So similar to Apex classes, you can also use methods in Visualforce. And the main ones that you're going to be using are the getter methods and the setter methods. So still in a rap song. So getter methods are included in every standard controller and also can be defined in your custom controllers. They are always required if you want to access values from within a page, such as looking at the columns or pulling in fields. So setter methods do the opposite. They allow you to set or submit user input values for the Visualforce page back into the database. However, it's actually not required if you've already bound your Visualforce page to a particular object. So if you have multiple objects on the same Visualforce page, you'll probably need to use a setter method. And so the syntax here for either one is this exclamation mark followed by the expression name. Okay. Got another quiz for you guys.
Okay,
All right,
quiz time.
Ooh. All right. Developer needs to create a Visualforce page that overrides the standard permissions. What controller do they need to accomplish this? Is it a standard list controller, a custom controller, a controller extension, or a setter method?
Andrew's weighing in custom. Narali says B.
Yeah, you guys know this.
Yeah.
See, I thought you were saying you didn't know Visualforce. Look at you go. All right, here's a fun one. What's the correct syntax for referencing a custom controller?
Bees. I see a lot of bees. Bees for Blanca. No, just kidding.
Yeah, so B is also the correct answer for this one. You actually, for a custom controller, it's a little tricky. So for standard, you actually write out standard, but for custom, it's just all by itself. So that kind of eliminates all the other options here. So you can see this says custom controller. And I've also added page block in here, which you always declare a controller in the Apex page element. All right, take a deep breath because we're going to go into dynamic Apex this time.
Dynamic what?
Yes. So I'll say that this is the part of the test where I spent the majority of my time trying to figure it out. Because there really isn't a specific trailhead module on it, and a lot of the documentation was using terminology I was really not familiar with. So the requirement to understand dynamic Apex comes from the statement that's buried in the exam guide. Describe how to programmatically access and utilize the object schema. Well, I found out the way you access the object schema is by using dynamic Apex. So what does that even mean?
It means that we need a superhero around, according to Melissa's comment in the chat box.
Oh, you're right. So dynamic Apex is a series of classes and methods that allow you to access the behind-the-scenes details of objects and fields. So if you think back to our boxes, the classes are the big box, and the methods are all the pieces inside the box. And there's also, and here's a few things that you can pull out of that box by calling the method. So some of the things you can pull in is field description details, the actual label name instead of the API name. You can check the security settings of the user who picks up the code, pull in the record type, pull in the pick list value, stuff like that. But the question I kept asking myself whenever I was looking through this is why? Why in the world would I want to pull in the field name or links into code when I could always navigate to that object and figure it out before you wrote the code? Well, the answer to that is that not all developers have that luxury. So if you're building something for the app exchanges, for example, you have to make sure it works for every target environment, no matter who downloads it. They can't go check out your environment and modify the code for you. So it also allows you to access information that might be hard to query, like, for example, you could query how many tabs a user has open or how many tabs are in an app. And then you can even combine the same code logic into different objects, stuff like that. So it's been a common theme throughout this week's topic. But the main purpose of all of this is always to provide more flexibility. So what makes up dynamic Apex? It's all contained in a single namespace called schema. So the namespace is a way to group collections of classes and methods that all perform similar functionalities. Coming back to our box, the namespace is the truck you put the box in. You put lots of boxes in that truck and they're all collected together. You'll see namespaces used a lot in managed packages from the App Exchange, in order to group all the different classes together so you're aware where they came from. And the way you declare a namespace is using dot notation, such as an example here, which is schema.report. So the namespace schema, so the name of the namespace is schema. It contains dozens of different predefined classes in there. A few examples I've seen are this describe field result class. This contains methods for describing fields on the object, or describing the object fields. The describe object result class contains methods for describing objects. And then that tab one I already mentioned, you can get all the metadata about standard or custom app tabs. If you recall, each box can have multiple methods inside of it that can be called. So the two most commonly used classes that you'll probably see on this exam are describe field result and describe object result. These are classes we talked about on the last slide as well. They contain many, many methods. That some specific examples include getting the default value of a field, getting the label or checklist value. Within this described object result class, you can also check user permissions. Can they access the record? Can they view it? Can they add to it? Can they delete the record? All that kind of stuff. So, but probably what you guys are wondering right now is, how does this all factor in the test? You need to know all this. As always, you may not have to code, but you will have to read it and pick the right syntax. So I provided some homework for you guys. Here are some links that I highly recommend you go through. Yes, I apologize for giving you homework, but first I recommend reading through all the different names of the schema classes. You just want to be able to recognize which ones are valid and which ones are made up. Next, I recommend reviewing the names of the methods contained in the two most commonly used schema classes that I've talked about. Luckily, the names are pretty self-evident. What they do, once again, you want to know which ones are fake and which ones are real.
And Mark added in a good comment. He said there's a new schema methods in the summer release. So we should be looking at the summer maintenance exam module on Trailhead before taking the exam. Just keeping up with all the updates. That's a great tip, Mark. Thank you.
All right, so I have a few, so I didn't call this next section a quiz. I'm calling it example questions because I want to give you guys an idea of what you should be studying for, but obviously I don't expect you guys to know all these answers since we didn't review, everything in this session. So the first question here, how can a developer check that a user can create records on the Visualforce page they're accessing? If someone wants to be our dynamic superhero and guess, you can go ahead.
Brooke says D. Andy says E.
E.
I say B for Baby Blazer.
Yeah. All right, so A is actually the correct answer on this one. The one thing to look for is that those two commonly used classes I talked about, they both end in result. So you can eliminate C because that's not a real class because there's no result at the end. Next, if you go and review the method names, it'll probably stick out to you that is insertable is fake. It's something I just made up. So that narrows it down to A or D. So these both have the real schema name, the real class. So we're just trying to decide between creatable and accessible. So if you go back to the question, it's asking who can create records. So that narrows it down to A for us because all details is whether or not the user can view the record at all, not whether or not they can create it.
I like this example, Kelsey, because I feel like when I took the first exam, I stumbled with the words, and there were quite a few of them that I had to go back and read either 2 or 3 times. And I will say, take a deep breath in between reading them. You can also mark them for review. So while you're taking the exam, you can click the little, I think it's like a checkbox, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I pretty much click everything.
Mark for review.
Exams.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to read it once or twice in a row and try to answer it. Sometimes if it's lengthier and you're not really sure, take a stab at it and then come back and read it again later and then try it, because there were a few that I ended up changing and I got a pretty good result on my exam, and I was not expecting that. So take your time and don't feel bad if you have to read it a few times. I think that one commonality that I've heard at Salesforce Saturdays and online in all these different virtual spaces is that interpreting what the question is asking you and looking for those hints and where they're trying to throw you off is key. And Mark says, if you're somewhere with paper testing in a test center, take a quick note on the question to come back to. Yeah, definitely. Sorry about that.
Okay, and then we have one more question example. So what 3 methods below can be accessed through the describe build result class? And this is so if you notice, I also like writing down whenever I'm taking a class, whenever I'm taking a test. Sometimes they tell you the right name of the class. So sometimes it can be useful if you have, let's say you have these 2 questions back to back. You say, oh, well, that's the real name of it. I'm going to go back to that one. So because usually they don't lie to you in the actual question. So it's always a good place to look for hints later on in the test. All right, so this is a 3-question one. So basically, which one is wrong? Which one did I make up?
Kelly is saying A, B, and D. We have another person, Sedi. I feel like I'm butchering that name, and please forgive me. Is saying A, B, and D. And we have Sumath saying A, C, and D.
Okay, close. So it's actually A, B, and C. So I made up the is standard designation. So all you got to do is just read through that homework I assigned you guys. And they should start, so if you read through it a few times, these should start popping out to you saying like, oh, well, I've never seen if standard. That's not a thing. And so that should start becoming more obvious to you in these questions. All
and
right.
no smile, no unhappy faces, Sumath, okay? Just because we get it right, it's a learning curve. And if we get it wrong and we acknowledge that, it helps reinforce. It's like muscle memory, so next time when you see the question, a trigger goes off, a light bulb, and it says, no, I'm not going to answer that way because I already know that I messed that up before. We learn from our mistakes, right? So we only want smiley faces.
Yeah. And that last slide wasn't a real quiz. That was just example, so it doesn't even count. All right, this is our last slide of the night, everyone. You made it through. So order of operations. I feel like this really summarizes all the different pieces we touched on tonight. Well, I personally don't think it's necessary to fully memorize this exact list. There are a few items to be aware of so you can answer questions on it. First is the fact that system validation rules run before the before triggers, but the custom validation rules you create on objects actually don't kick off until after the before triggers have run. So it's possible for your before trigger to have invalid data inserted into it. What does that mean? So if you have certain validation rules on your system and you're planning on them to work before your before triggers, you could run into a situation where your trigger bombs out and sends up a really confusing error message before your custom validation rule with the pretty error messages ever pops up. That's one thing to look out for. The next piece is that once the after triggers and the other declarative rules from 6 to 9 run, it's possible for your before triggers, validation rules, etc., to be kicked off again. And this is where you get into that recursive or government limits territory if you aren't careful. Another important thing for you to remember is that everything from 11 through 14 runs after the triggers. My team in particular has run into issues where we tried to create a trigger that sends an email out that contained a value in a roll-up summary field, and it kept sending out the wrong amount, and I swear it was blowing our minds for the longest time why. But one look at this list, and it was obvious that the trigger was sending out before the roll-up field ever calculated, so of course it couldn't. So we just solved that by calculating the roll-up ourselves in the before trigger, rather than just trying to pull in the field. So does anybody else have any tips or tricks for remembering this order?
Sumath says VAAWE.
What does that stand for? Validation. I don't know.
Validation, assignment, auto response, workflow, and escalations.
Okay, that's a good one. Bowie.
Anyone else? Oh, Sophie says, I have it memorized for the admin part, but haven't done the Apex trigger components. She has Victoria arrive remarkably well educated.
I like that. So maybe remember that and just insert in the code pieces.
And tips like this, I know we don't always have enough time on these calls, right, to cover content, questions, and everything, but these little tidbits on test taking or little tidbits on memorizing things and acronyms that'll help us memorize, throw them in the Slack channel because we can keep track of these and, you know, help each other remember. And Lord knows with mommy brain, I need all the help in that area.
All right. So we didn't cover everything in this session today, but I did summarize everything I wasn't able to get to, and I have some links here for you to read through, a couple trailheads. So if you have some time, it'd be good to at least skim the content to be sure you're familiar with it. All right. So that's it for me. Does anybody have any questions or items you'd like to go over again? It looks like we have about 15 minutes left.
My brain is fried. I hear you. And it was fantastic. Yes, Andrew is right on with that.
Thank you, Andrew.
And somebody else did mention that they will study and then they will watch the recording again. As soon as the recording is ready for me, I'll throw it in the Google Drive. So by tomorrow, you should have that. I usually always send it to Gemma immediately as well, so she can get it up on the Ladies Be Architects website. So look for it tomorrow on the site.
Awesome. I'll try and not listen to it in my own voice. All right, back to you.
So thank you for covering that today, Kelsey. That was a lot of content to get through in a very, very short time. And I know that it was, it took a lot of time to put that together. So we really, 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 really appreciate that. And as Jennifer said, wonderful session. Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you, guys.
The other thing that I will say is that we will be meeting next week, and we are going to be meeting consecutively from now on. We don't have any big Salesforce events coming in that may steal away some of our thunder for that day. So again, we're meeting next week and every week through that. I have a few updates to just announce. One of that is that I did get a message from Charlie earlier today, and she will be presenting on Heroku. So she knows the remaining of our schedule, and I've told her to check her calendar, and she's going to let me know which Thursday she will be able to participate. So as soon as she gives me confirmation, I will definitely let everybody know in the study group so that everyone can be on the call. I know Heroku, it's kicking my butt too. It's, you know, it's a foreign area, and it's nice when you have someone who can pitch in and who can shine some light and insight on it. So as soon as I know, I will definitely share the word with everybody. The other thing is that we do have a lot of folks who are interested in a mini session on flow and pseudocode. So I will facilitate people who can help kind of be panelists or some sort. It won't be anything really formal, but something that we can work on to provide some additional information on flow, and then another session on pseudocode. So Mark, thanks for volunteering. And Brooke, thanks for throwing out the idea in need of some more support. And anytime you guys encounter something like this, just shout it out. Let me know, send it via email or put it somewhere out there so we are aware, and we will do our best to make accommodations for it. Again, I want to say congratulations to Hema for passing her Platform Developer 1 certification exam. We are so very proud of you, and thank you for joining us tonight and staying on the entire call. We're very, very, very happy for you. Last but not least, I know that some of you all have participated in the Rad Women Code program for the first round. I will tell you that apparently I think they're kicking off a pilot because I saw an email earlier this evening. So if you were looking for part 2, check and see if you have an email from them. I don't know how things are working, but I think they may have started reaching out to folks for the second session. So it's like a second level. It's not the first level one, but the second level. The first one, they already put a call out a few weeks back. But if you're waiting for the second session, check your email boxes and see if you have anything in there. Does anyone have any last minute comments or questions you want to tackle before we hang up? Is Rad Women open to everyone like Ladies Be Architects? That's a great question. I don't think as of this time it is. I can definitely ask and find out. I know that there was some kind of survey or something that went out.
Hey, Blanca.
Yeah.
This is Jen Bowen. I just went through their intro today. They had a webinar on the Rad Women courses. So no, it's not open to everyone. You had to register for their webinar first, and then you basically are added to a pool and you get, it's like a lottery drawing. But if you had been on their list previously, you have better chances of getting in. So if you're interested in Rad Women, I would say try to get into it as soon as possible. And always, I keep my digest on daily for their public site because it's really super popular.
Yeah,
And
that's a good point.
It's a required orientation that you have to go to before you can even apply. And the last one is Monday, I believe. I believe it's the 20th.
Yeah, and at this point, I don't even know if you can even register for those anymore.
Because they said they had 250 applicants already for probably 80 spots.
Right.
Yes. And I will tell you, ladies, don't be discouraged, okay? When I did one of the orientation sessions, I found out about it last minute. I wasn't even familiar with it. I attended an orientation. There were like 300 people already have participated on the orientations, and I want to say they had like over 80 or 100 that were on the wait list. So it really is by lottery, and there is a chance. So if you can register for an intro session, do it. And try to get in there. You know, and it is high in popular demand, and I know that they're always looking for ways to be able to expand reach. But yeah, we do have to have a lot of patience because it is a very hot program.
They also said that they didn't think that their course was good for being able to pass this exam because they don't specifically concentrate on platform developer 1. They're concentrating more on just like understanding and reading and writing code. So I think it's a good complement to this, but I don't think that you can pass your exam by taking their course. They said you'd have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, I would agree. And Kelly's on here. She did the Rad Women with me, and so did Jane. And I know that, you know, we're still learning. So I would totally agree with you on that one.
Yeah, it's basically, can you guys hear me? It's an introduction, and I think for the sessions that they require you to go, it's just so that you understand that there's a lot of homework and that you can make the time, because they want to make sure that if you're going to sign up, and because there's a lot of people signing up or wanting to be on the list, that you can make the commitment within those, I think, hour and a half or 2 hours. Because there are homework, and if you kind of don't keep up, you do kind of tend to fall behind. So
yeah, and because there's such a high demand, like you can only miss one session out of their whole 10 weeks. They really are expecting you to be on every session. And that's because there are so many people that really, really want to go after this. It doesn't make sense for folks who know that they can't make that time commitment. it's probably better off to hold off and try at another time when you have more time to commit to it.
Yeah, and it's a good course. I loved it because I got to meet Blanca and Jane on there, and my group was awesome. But like if you can't make the time commitment, I think the David Liu class, because we use that. I know Blanca and I, we use that a lot to complement our rad learning too. So if you're more of learn as you go type of person, and if you can't make the time commitment, those classes on Pluralsight are awesome.
Yeah, again, I will say the classes on Pluralsight, including the channels that I shared that Don Robbins made for us, he flat out said, look, this is not going to guarantee that you're going to pass the certification. These are just supplemental tools to help reinforce things and help for you to be aware of what it is that you don't know that you should know. So again, let's focus on the trailheads. Let's focus on, what we're sharing on the live sessions and what we're bringing to resources in the Google Drive. But because we know everyone's on different levels and some people want to have more hands-on and have more experience and want to explore a little bit more, we're just trying to bring as many resources, and you can pick and choose, how much or how little is good for you.
Yeah, and I'll also add to that I use Focus-on-Course for studying for all my exams. And it is a lot of help. Their study guides and also their exam questions are fabulous.
And Mark says PD1 has a lot of non-code concepts in it that are major portions of it. And a lot of PD1 is understanding the concepts and requirements of the platform, probably way more so than understanding the code itself. Thanks, Mark, for sharing the insight on that. Okay, so if no one has any last minute things to ask, we'll wrap for tonight, and we'll meet again next Thursday. And be on the lookout for recordings and slide decks in Google Drive and everything. Thank you again, Kelsey, so much. We really, really, really appreciate everything, because I know it took a lot of effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey.
No problem. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Bad words. Who cares?
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to log off, everyone. Have a great night.